So, due to last week's issues with the going live, I'm coming to you Saturday to go over last week's lesson. Last week we went over Acts 21 through 16. So, I'm going to kind of just walk through my notes and give a brief summary. Tomorrow we're going to cover Paul's speech to the Ephesians, the Ephesian elders. So, that's 18 through 35. So in Acts 19:21, we learned that Paul was planning three important journeys. First, he was going to Macedonia and Achaia. He was going to return to the churches that were planted to provide strength and encouragement, much like he always did. Then he was going to go on to Jerusalem to provide a report to the church and deliver the offering being collected from the Gentiles. Finally, his hope was to go to Rome. There he was going to move his base of operations to Rome from Antioch so that he could further share the gospel throughout Spain and further west. Acts 20 records for us the completion of the first journey, the beginning of the second journey. So we find in this chapter both a journey motif and an encouragement motif. So I'm going to read Acts 20:1 through 16. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, he was about to set sail for Syria. He decided to return through Macedonia. So Peter the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians Tychicus and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. But going ahead to the ship, we set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. And when he met us at Assos, we took him on board and went to Mytilene. And sailing from there, we came the following day opposite Chios. The next day we touched at Samos. And the day after that, we went to Miletus. For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So when we last left Paul, he was being prevented from going to the theater by a group of his fellow disciples, along with a few of the Asiarch officials. Now that riot had been dispersed, Paul prepares to leave Ephesus. Although he had been in great danger and had suffered considerable distress, Paul was always centered on the welfare of others. As he has done on so many occasions during his journeys, Paul brings the disciples together to give them encouragement. The verses say, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. So even though he was still in danger, the riot had dispersed, but there was still that possible spark, if you would. If somebody saw him, it could erupt again. In spite of this great danger, Paul calls his disciples together because he's concerned about them. The Greek word here is perikleo, for encouragement. This forms an inclusio in verses 1 and 12. It starts with encouragement and it ends with encouragement. This encouragement was meant to comfort them and exhort them to carry on during Paul's absence from them. As we will see later, Paul knew he would not be returning to them in Ephesus, and he wanted to leave them with some encouragement. So after speaking with the disciples, exhorting them and providing this encouragement to them, Paul and his group leaves Ephesus on the return journey to Macedonia. Now, Luke doesn't give us much information about the trip to Macedonia, only that much encouragement was given at each stop. As it says that when he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. So that's all we really know about that trip from Ephesus up through Macedonia and then over into Greece. It says once he got to Greece, he spent 3 months, more than likely at Corinth, which was the capital at the time. Using 2 Corinthians, we can fill in some of the blanks. We know that Paul first stopped at Troas, and the reason he stopped there was that he hoped to meet Titus there, returning with a report from Corinth. While he was in Ephesus, multiple times he had sent back and forth to Corinth. Remember on the map, the dotted line there has a over and back real quick. That was kind of a painful visit. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But he hoped to meet Titus at Corinth with a report back, because he had sent Titus over to them with a letter and was hoping to have a report back to them. Didn't happen at Troas. So drawing from the earlier journeys that he went in Macedonia, we can deduce that some of the steps that he probably made were at Neapolis, Philippi, Amphipolis, Apollonia, and Berea. Speculation that Paul may have stayed in Philippi for quite some time, maybe a year and a half, while he waited for Titus and or to evangelize Illyricum. If you go to Romans 15:18 through 19, Paul talks about, let me just go there real quick. There's some differences in the scholars here about whether Paul was there that long on this trip or maybe a later trip. Because in Romans 15:18 through 19, Paul states, "For I will not dare to speak of any of those things which Christ has not accomplished through me in word and deed to make the Gentiles obedient, in mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about to Illyricum I have fully preached the gospel of Christ." Illyricum is the area just kind of north and east of Philippi. So it's a huge territory there. And so at some point, whether it was on this journey or a later journey, maybe on a later journey to Rome, or that Paul may have stayed an extended time in Philippi. It could have been this time as he waited for Titus to catch up to him. And it could have been also at this time that he did that preaching in Illyricum. At any rate, Titus did meet up with him here in Philippi, bringing the report, and it was from Philippi that he actually wrote one of the letters to the Corinthians. And then after they got done in Philippi, they went on to Greece, where, again, as we said, he spent 3 months there in Corinth. Now, Corinth and Ephesus play a pretty important role in Paul's missionary journeys. We'll come back to Ephesus, but let's briefly talk about his time in Corinth and his letters to the Corinthians. We know of 4 letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, let me get there real quick. 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul talks about the first letter, if you will, that he wrote. Now, we know that there's a 1 Corinthians and a 2 Corinthians, but what we do know and can deduce from these letters is that there were at least two other letters that Paul wrote. First of all, in 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul writes, "I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people." Now, Paul's writing this letter, the 1 Corinthians letter at this point, and inside of this letter, he says, "I wrote to you in my epistle." In other versions, "I wrote to you in my earlier letter." So we know that there was an earlier letter before First Corinthians that Paul had written to the Corinthians, excuse me, telling them to stay away from sexually immoral people. Then the letter of First Corinthians here was written after that letter and was written during his 3-year stay at Ephesus. Sometime after he wrote this First Corinthians letter, and the previous letter mentioned here in First Corinthians, and then First Corinthians in his stay at Ephesus, Paul again had made a couple journeys back and forth. Paul was always communicating with his churches out there. He would dispatch somebody to go with a letter or go with a word of encouragement to them or to inquire and get a report. So he was constantly, even though he was in Ephesus for 3 years, he was constantly sending people out. And it was no different to the church in Corinth. He would send, again, we know of at least 2 letters here that he had sent already. And he also made that tearful journey across, that painful journey across to Corinth from Ephesus and back. And we know that because in 2 Corinthians 2, 3, and 4 says that, and I wrote this very thing to you, lest when I come, I should have sorrow over those from whom I ought to have joy, having confidence in you all, that my joy is the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart, I wrote to you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that you might know the love for which I have so abundantly for you. And you can even go even further into 2:12. It says, furthermore, when I came to Troas to preach Christ's gospel, and a door was opened by my Lord there, talks about him staying there for a little bit. And then in chapter 7, verses 5 through 13, for indeed, when we came to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts and inside were fears. Nevertheless, God, who comforts the downcast, comfort us by the coming of Titus. And it goes on to talk about that report that Titus had given to them. So we have that first letter that he talks about in 1 Corinthians 5:9. Then we have what we call 1 Corinthians, which should actually be the second letter to the church in Corinth. Then we have a tearful, severe letter that he mentions in 2 Corinthians. And then finally, we know that that he wrote 2 Corinthians from Philippi after receiving the report of Titus. So those are the 4 communications. And again, that was pretty common for Paul to send out dispatches and communicate with the churches in the area while he was at Ephesus. And in Philippi, he also, while he was in Philippi, he also wrote the Roman, the letter to the Romans in Philippi. Now, from Corinth, after staying there for 3 months, he intended to sail back to Syria to deliver the collection that they had received from the Gentiles. So he was going to go straight from Corinth, sailing straight over to Syria. Remember, we know that he wanted to get back to Jerusalem by Pentecost. So there's between the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Pentecost, there are 49 days, 7 weeks. So we know those journeys, you can't just hop on a plane and be there. You had to go by land or by boat at that time. And it was a pretty long and arduous journey. So many people, many Jews that were going to head to Jerusalem for Pentecost, they were doing this same trip. And Paul had planned on doing this. So Paul had the collection on him. Paul was also hated by some of the Jews. And we learn here that a plot was hatched by some Jews against Paul and his entourage. But through the Holy Spirit, that plot was discovered, and Paul changed his plans. And instead of going by sea, he returned backtracking through Macedonia and going by land over to Troas and on down. We'll get to that in just a second. Verse 4 lists a group of people that were accompanying Paul on this collection. Now, these were church leaders. from the various churches that had provided some of the collection. The first one is mentioned is Sopater. We know he was from the church at Berea. And as Cord and I like to tell you, we want you to be like the Bereans. And that is to don't take our word for it, go to the word and vet what we say against the word, just like the Bereans did. The fact that Luke mentions that he was the son of Pyrrhus means that Pyrrhus must have been a well-known leader in the church and would have been well known to the readers of this of the book of Acts here, of Luke's narrative. Now, there is some thought that the Sopater mentioned here is the same Sosipater that is mentioned in Romans 16:21, due to variations of spelling and translations and stuff. The second person, and it actually mentions that the next ones are Thessalonians. So we have Aristarchus. We first met Aristarchus when in 1929, when he was one of the two, he and Gaius of Macedonia were taken by the followers of Artemis during the riot because they couldn't find Paul. They found the next best thing, guilty by association, grabbed up Aristarchus and Gaius at Macedonia. So we know he was a Thessalonian. We know he also accompanied Paul to Rome. We'll find him, he'll be mentioned again in Acts 27:2. In Colossians 4:10 and Philemon 24, we find out that he was a fellow prisoner of Paul's. And we, just from tradition, we kind of believe he may have been martyred by Nero as well. The next Thessalonian is Secundus. Secundus, that name means second, and generally it was a slave name. Could also have been the second born of a family was given the name Secundus. Generally, the slaves, the main slave, were given the name Primus. The second one would be Secundus. And of course, we know Tertius, another slave from later on, that would have been the third level, if you will, the third in the hierarchy of the slaves and servants of that person. Again, it could also be the second born son of a family. Moving on from the Thessalonians, he mentions a Gaius of Derbe. Now, Derbe is in Asia Minor, from Galatia. It's a city in Galatia. The reason he says this is Gaius from Derbe is to distinguish him from the Gaius that was captured with Aristarchus. It's two different people. If he would have said Gaius, just Gaius, we would have believed that it was probably that one. But this was a Gaius from Derbe in Asia Minor. And he puts him right next with Timothy. Timothy was from Lystra, also from Asia Minor. So Timothy is very, very, it's likely that Timothy and Gaius of Derbe knew each other because they were both in Asia Minor, in Galatia. We know Timothy. We know a lot about Timothy. We know him as Paul's true son in the faith. Paul writes that in 1 Timothy 1:2. Again, as I said, he was a Galatian from Lystra in South Central Asia. Moving on from those, he gets to the last two in the group that he calls the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. Now, Tychicus is a native of Asia Minor. Along with Onesimus, he carried the Colossian letter from Paul. We find that in Colossians 4:7 and 9. He was also dispatched by Paul to Ephesus, which we can find in 2 Timothy 4:12, and Titus 3:12 tells us he was also dispatched to Crete. Again, we believe he was possibly martyred as well. Trophimus is a Gentile Christian from Ephesus. Here in Acts 21, we're going to find a time where Paul was falsely charged with defiling the temple by taking a Gentile into the temple. Of course, it was a false charge. Paul didn't happen, but that person that he was accused of taking into the temple was this Trophimus. We also find from 2 Timothy 4:20 that Trophimus was left in Miletus due to sickness. Not sure if it was this journey or if it was a later journey. There's probably more evidence that it was a later journey on one of Paul's journeys to Rome after being imprisoned in Rome. The end of Acts, when he was imprisoned in Rome for a little bit, he was let go and went out and did some stuff before he was captured again, or imprisoned again, not captured, but imprisoned and arrested, and then eventually martyred. Again, apart from Timothy, we don't know much about the rest of these men, except that they were faithful followers of Christ. Dr. Jeff Orch, who is the CEO and president, if you will, of the Southern Baptist Convention's Executive Committee, would call these the shadow Christians, because they served without much recognition, much like they would adhere to what Paul writes in Colossians 3:23 and 24. Paul says, "And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ." That's what these men did, adhered to exactly what Paul says in Colossians 3:23 and 24. Now, after he lists these men, he talks in verses 5 and 6, says that these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. Now, what we don't know is if these were all 7 of these, or if it were just the last 2. Depending on the Greek grammar, an argument could be made that's to say that these were just the last 2. They were the Asians, and they were going to Troas in Asia to plan ahead and secure the boat and everything else, and that the other 5, along with Timothy and Paul, stayed behind. Or some could argue that the Greek, it meant that all 7 went on ahead and only Paul and Timothy stayed behind. At any rate, whether it was the 2 or all 7, they went ahead to Troas to make accommodations and set up and wait for Paul and Timothy. How do we know it's Timothy? Because finally we get another of the we passages. This is, "But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread." So the 2 or the 5, or the whole 7 went to Troas, and we stayed back and celebrated the days of unleavened bread there in Philippi. The last time we had a we passage was Acts 16:10 through 17 from Philippi. So if we go back to Acts 16:10 and 17, we see where they were talking about we, and then from that point to now, there is no more we passages. It's always Paul and his companions or whatever. So there is argument there, or most scholars agree that Luke stayed behind in Philippi, and then at this trip, when Paul came back into Philippi at this time, Luke joined him up again and went to Corinth with him and back to on this journey back into Jerusalem. So again, they celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Philippi, and after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they sailed to Troas. It took them 5 days to get to Troas, and once they got to Troas, they were there for 7 more days, probably because the ship wasn't leaving for 7 days, and they stayed, had to stay there that long. The first trip that we learn about in verse 11 of chapter 16, it said that trip took between Neapolis and Troas took 2 days, whereas this time it took 5 days, generally because of when you're going, so you're going from Neapolis from Troas to Neapolis, there's the tailwind, if you will, and the currents and all of that would have been favorable to a ship heading in that direction. Whereas coming back you would have to go a different route. to get to the currents, and it took 5 days this time instead of the 2. Once they got to Troas again, they stayed there for 7 days. Now, that's kind of a little journey motif that when we're going to end with another journey motif, but right in the middle of this, Luke puts a kind of a humorous narrative to a point. He talks about Eutychus. It says, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread. So the first day of the week is, of course, Sunday. We know that in the Jewish calendar, Sunday is the first day of the week, and Saturday is the 7th, which Saturday was the Sabbath. So this day is a Sunday because this is the first day of the week. This is the first reference to worship on Sundays found in Acts or in the New Testament, in fact. The group had gathered to break bread. So here we have the very first mention of gathering on a Sunday. And what did they gather for? They gathered for the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 10, 16, and 17, and 11, 17 through 24 talks about breaking bread and during the Lord's Supper. So based on that, we should consider this, where they gathered on the first day of the week to break bread, should be they were partaking of the Lord's Supper at this time. Now, today we know we meet on Sunday morning for our main worship service. This being the first day of the week back then, they would have been working on Sunday. They didn't work on the Sabbath. They worked on all the other days. So this being Sunday, they would have been at work. Because they would have been at work during the day, this service would have started in the evening, probably 5 or 6 o'clock. It's important to note because many of the people in this meeting, if you will, would have worked all day, then come to this room, and we're in the Mediterranean. It's April, late March, early April, mid-April. So it's probably pretty good weather there in the Mediterranean, maybe a little hot, a little muggy. And they're in this room of an evening after working all day, tired, right? And we know that Paul talked with them a very long time. We don't know what he was saying. He was preaching, teaching, maybe equipping them for what lay ahead because he knew he was leaving and not coming back. Maybe he was giving them an update on his trials, whatever. And it's probably maybe both of it, a little bit of both of it. But whatever the case was be, he talked a long time. It says he prolonged his speech until midnight. So if they started at 6, he was preaching for 6 hours, right? And here they are crowded in this room, in an upper room, we know it's the 3rd floor from verse 9. And it says that it's midnight, so it's dark. And the only light they had were oil lamps, right? That they would light. And these lights are flickering, taking the oxygen from the room, as well as all these people in it. If you've ever been in a hot, stuffy room, after a very long day, you're really tired and you're trying to listen to somebody. And so it says that there were many lamps in this upper room where they were gathered. There was this young man named Eutychus. Now, the Greek word for young man is neanos, and is used to describe a male who's not yet reached 40 years of age. So we think this man was 39 or younger. Right? Later on, we're going to find out he was a whole lot younger than that. The name Eutychus actually means good fortune or lucky. And that's where kind of the humor part happens, because here this young man named Eutychus, whose name is Lucky or Good Fortune, is in this room and beginning to feel sleepy. So he goes over probably to the window, opens the window, try to get some fresh air. He's sitting here at this window, and it says he's fighting sleep, right? Paul continues to talk, and the longer that Paul talked, the sleepier Eutychus kept trying to fight it, and Paul kept talking, Eutychus got sleepier. Paul talked, Eutychus got sleepier, to the point where Eutychus fell out of the window. This lucky man fell out of the window instead of falling into the window. He leaned too far out, fell out. We know they were on the third floor. He fell out, and the nature of these buildings, he hit pretty hard ground. There wasn't a soft bunch of bushes or anything down there. He probably hit hard rocky ground, or maybe he hit the wall or whatever. But the fact is, he fell out, and it says that they ran down to him, and it says he was taken up dead. Not that he was taken up as dead, which would say, oh, he fell down and it seemed like he was dead, but he really wasn't. No, he was taken up dead. He wasn't just knocked out. He was taken up for dead. The crowd recognized indeed that this young man was dead from the fall. Verses 10 and 12 tell us that Paul went down and bent over him and took him in his arms. And this is kind of much like Elijah and Elisha, and is actually, as I said, this is the last of 8 or 9 examples in the Bible of the dead being raised. In 1 Kings 17 through 24, Elijah raises a young boy. In 2 Kings 4, 32 through 37, Elisha raises the young boy who was the only child of the Shunammite couple. And this one holds some very unique characteristics between the two of them, because we know that if we go back to 2 Kings 4, we know that Elisha laid down on the boy, covered him completely. And here we see that Paul picked him up and drew him to himself. So there's that similarities there. Jesus himself raised a widow's grown son in Luke 7, 11 through 16. Jesus raised Jairus' daughter in Luke 8, 49 through 56. And of course, we all know that in John 11, 43 through 44, Jesus raised Lazarus. And of course, Jesus himself was raised. In Acts, Peter raised Dorcas, Acts 9, 36 through 42. And then depending on how you take Acts 14, 19 through 20, when Paul was taken outside of the city and stoned, whether he was actually dead or just knocked out, because it says there that the people left him for dead, or left him as dead. So that kind of, if you read that one way, you could say, yes, Paul was raised from the dead. Or if you read it another way, Paul wasn't. He was just merely knocked out, and everybody gathered around him and he came to. Anyway, again, Paul reached the scene, immediately bent over him, wrapped his arms around him, proclaimed that Eutychus was not dead. So when he wrapped his arms around him and pulled him to himself, the power of Jesus, the power of the Spirit, healed and brought the kid back to life. The verb here for that is used here to talk about Eutychus is the word pious, which pais, P-A-I-S, and it can mean a young boy or a servant. So earlier we said he was under 40. This one kind of tends to say he was a young boy, between, a young teenager maybe, possibly a young slave, a young servant boy. Luke tells us here in these verses that after the commotion, Paul went back upstairs. He broke bread again, probably ate a meal this time, rather than having the Lord's Supper again. The breaking of bread this time was probably eating a meal. Everybody was pretty excited about all of the commotion and stuff that had gone. So the weariness and the tiredness of everybody was not, had kind of dissipated, and they were kind of revived with the meal, with the excitement and all of that. They were revived, so much so that we're told that Paul continued speaking until daybreak in all of this excitement. And then at daybreak, he departed from them. Verses 13 through 16, we're told we pick up another journey motif. Now, before I get back into that, I want to note that at the end of verse 12, it says that he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they, meaning the people that were there, took the youth, that's the teenager, away alive, and were not a little comforted. This term comforted is also the parakleo that we talked earlier. So that's the encouragement part. And then we go into another journey here, verses 13 through 16, where we see his trip from Troas down to Miletus, where we're going to pick up tomorrow. Luke and whoever else we know is Luke, and at least Luke and Timothy, headed to the ship at daybreak, where they were going to depart Troas to go to Miletus. Their itinerary was as follows. Their first planned stop was at Assos, a seaport in Mysia in Asia Minor. Now, for some unknown reason, Paul didn't accompany the group on the ship, but instead walked to Assos, which is about 20 or so miles. Now, whether it was, nobody knows why he did it, but he decided to walk instead of ride the ship. At some point, they all got together in Assos. Paul joins them, gets on the ship there, and from Assos, they sail down to Mytilene, which is the main city on the island of Lesbos in the Aegean Sea, about 44 miles further south from Assos. They spent the night in Assos, left the next day, and came to the principal city on the island of Chios, which is actually the city named Chios, which is on that island, a rocky mountainous island in the east central area of the Aegean Sea. Again, they spent the night there, left and sailed down to Samos, which was a small Greek island off the coast of Asia Minor in the Aegean Sea. It was southwest of Ephesus and northwest of their final destination of Miletus. From there, they went on down to Miletus, which was an important Greek city at the mouth of the Meander River. Paul wanted to avoid Ephesus because he was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost. And he was afraid that if he went to Ephesus, that he would get caught up there either in ministry or in, there was a riot the last time I was there. So he didn't want to get caught up in that. So they ended up at Miletus, where we're going to pick up with tomorrow's lesson, where we see where he calls the elders and gives them a speech, his final farewell speech, if you will. So we will pick it up there on Sunday. I hope you enjoy this recap of what you learned last Sunday. See you tomorrow.